As we near the one-year anniversary of October 7th earlier this month, Harvard's Institute of Politics, its largest student organization and flagship platform for political discourse, saw a high-profile shakeup in its student leadership.
Citing the Palestinian exception to free speech, a vocal pro-Palestine activist resigned as the chair of one of the Institute of Politics' popular programs on campaigns and advocacy.
The reason? Closed-door infighting over how to handle the 2024 elections in Israel-Palestine in its programming.
As concerns about free speech and censorship ramp up, the IOP shakeup marked a fundamental disagreement between the IOP's top student leadership on how to handle political campus discourse on Israel and Palestine.
Today on Newstalk, we join our reporters to break down the dispute. And
my name is Nuriel Verdegraf, the former chair of CAP.
We joined the student who resigned to hear his version of the story.
From 14 Plimpton Street, I'm Frank Joe.
And I'm Yael Goldstein.
This is Newstalk.
Hi, my name's William Mao.
And I'm Dhruv Patel.
And we cover the Harvard Kennedy School and the Institute of Politics for the Crimson.
Thank you so much, William and Drew, for joining us. So last week we saw a pretty high-profile resignation from the Institute of Politics amid controversy over the Institute of Politics' handling of issues surrounding Israel and Palestine. But before we get into all of that, could you first tell us what is the Institute of Politics in the first place and why is it important? Why does it matter?
For sure. The Institute of Politics, also known as the IOP, is the biggest student organization on Harvard's campus. And it does everything related to politics, especially U.S. politics. The IOP has more than a dozen programs, each chaired by a different student. It has more than 1,000 student members, so that's like an eighth of the student body at Harvard College.
So you mentioned that the IOP has more than a dozen programs, and this departure concerns one of them, the Campaigns and Advocacy Program. Tell us what that is and what the Campaigns and Advocacy Program is all about.
So the Campaign and Advocacy Program, otherwise known as CAP, is one of the IOP's flagship programs as its introductory program for students interested in expanding their knowledge in politics, in democratic systems, and in the election. Very much similar to a Election 101 course. Over the span of 10 weeks, students get to learn about the fundamental tenets of an election and of a democracy. Sample topics in past years have included what is polling? What is a campaign? What is an ad? What does it mean to spend money on a campaign? What does it mean to run an election? What is a runoff election? Key questions like that students need to know before they join some of the other IOP programming to be able to teach other members and other folks in the Harvard community about the political system.
For sure. So it sounds like for a program that's essentially like an Election 101, there's got to be a curriculum. And it seems like that's also the heart of the issue here, right? That it was sort of tensions over what curriculum CAP would offer to its students. So tell us then a little bit about the student leader at CAP and sort of the curriculum that he'd proposed heading into this summer and this fall.
Right. 100%. That's exactly right. The key question and key debate here is what exactly CAP would cover this semester. So essentially how it works is that each one of the IOP's program chairs must submit a proposal to the IOP Executive Committee sometime in the summer detailing A, what are they planning on doing this upcoming semester, and B, how could the executive team support them. So in late June, Nuriel, the program chair of CAP, the former program chair, I should say, submitted a proposal to the IOP executive team about a 10-week course for the fall 2024 semester that would focus on topics including the election, the 2024 election. What are some of the key issues that folks are going to be voting on in November and 40 days from now? That said, near August 25th, things began to shift a little bit. Nuriel decided to reach out to the IOP executive team, saying that he was interested in updating what he had already received approval for over the summer. And at that point, he was interested in focusing a little bit more on the Israel and Palestine conflict and what that meant for the 2024 election. And that's where this controversy and this debate really fueled from.
Well, it's important to note, too, the timeline here, right? So from June to August, had the IOP sort of run with Nuriel's proposal already? Had it begun sort of doing some of its promotion work?
Yeah, actually, so starting on July 1st, the IOP's Common App, which allows prospective students or prospective applicants to apply to join the IOP, was sent out. That means this original plan that was focused on the U.S. elections, 2024, had been advertised at least over the web to prospective students, incoming first years, et cetera, starting on July 1st.
For sure. So then from July 1st until August, when Nuriel puts out this proposal, the world thinks that CAP is going to be focusing on elections 2024. What is the content of Nuriel's new proposal in August, and why was it that it ultimately escalated to the level of disagreement among IOP's leadership?
Right, that's a good question. When Nuriel submitted his proposal in late August to the IOP executive team, some of the key things that I was focusing on was very much pro-Palestine advocacy. What does that mean? Well, concepts like, what is Kamala Harris doing in terms of an arms embargo on Israel? Over the summer, we saw a lot of conflict in Washington relating to the issue of Palestine. And so the course was focusing exactly on that. What does it mean to be a Palestinian lawmaker? What does it mean to advocate for Palestine? And we were seeing speakers from a lot of prolific movements, right? The BDS movement. Nuriel was seeking to have someone from the Boston chapter of the movement come to the IOP and speak with students. And so that was sort of the focus of that August proposal. And let us note that at that time, his original proposal that was submitted on August 29th, it did not have a single Israeli speaker. And that's something that Nuriel actually confirmed for us. And he had mentioned that, hey, that proposal that I submitted on August 29th, maybe it wasn't perfect. That's something that he's telling us. And so what we see in the weeks after is a lot of debate and controversy between IOP staff and the executive team and Nuriel on where exactly CAP would take its focus for this semester, right? I think it's important to note that this change was very much so an 11th hour change. Students had already applied under the original proposal. 120 students, in fact, were applying under the original proposal. And so Nuriel's change really came, at the last second. And so IOP staff and the executive team was saying that, hey, first and foremost, this proposal that you're giving us is too biased. It's too one-sided. And so Nuriel went back to the drawing board and submitted revised proposals after that included maybe a week more of, Israeli advocacy talk. But the original proposal that he had submitted was very much focused on pro-Palestine advocacy with speakers from a number of prolific Palestine movements.
For sure. And the BDS, of course, being the boycott, divest, sanction movement. And this is all coming against the backdrop of a Harvard campus that has been roiled by conflict and protest and tensions surrounding Israel and Palestine in past semesters. And Nuriel himself was very much a big part of that. Tell us about some of his work as a pro-Palestine activist on campus.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, Nuriel was involved in the pro-Palestine encampment in Harvard Yard last spring that caught national headlines and obviously was a huge deal on Harvard's campus. And so he was very much involved there. He was quoted in the Crimson previously speaking about the value of that encampment. And so he has been involved in the past with pro-Palestine advocacy on campus.
So Nuriel, being a vocal pro-Palestine activist on campus for the entirety of the spring semester, he nonetheless still submitted a proposal that was about elections 2024 in July. It's only in August that he chooses to change his mind. What led to his change of heart?
Yeah, so Dhruv and I had heard from two sources familiar with his decision-making that he had attended the DNC or at least watched the DNC this summer and had reflected a lot on the state of U.S. politics, especially pro-Palestine advocacy in U.S. politics, how the Democratic Party was thinking about this issue, and sort of had a change of heart, or at least reflected more and decided that this was something that was really important to him, to use his opportunities as a leader of CAP to really highlight this issue and expand opportunities for students to learn more about pro-Palestine advocacy in the States.
And I think, if anything, that again just indicates how fast this entire situation quickly escalated, right? The DNC ended on August 22nd, and by August 25th, Nuriel had already reached out to the IOP executive team saying, hey, I want to update my proposal that you all gave me approval on over the summer. And so that 3-day turnaround there was incredibly fast. We're hearing from our sources that people really weren't expecting to have this last-minute change in CAP's curriculum, and the rest is only history from there.
For sure. So tell us then about how the infighting escalated, right, into September. It seems like after Nuriel submitted this proposal, a whole host of things kicks off.
Right. So let's talk dates a little bit, right? So August 25th, Nuriel's reaching out to the IOP executive team saying, I want to update my proposal. They were originally saying, what are you hoping to do? What is this new content that you're hoping to add? And over the span of the next 4 days, we're seeing a lot of internal conversations and internal meetings between the IOP executive team, other members of CAP leadership, and Nuriel on the direction of the program. So they meet several times informally as well as formally. And by August 29th, Nouriel has submitted a proposal, which we had talked about earlier, to the IOP executive team, an updated one. And so that is sort of episode one here. In early September, a week after he had submitted the proposal, Nouriel has a meeting with the IOP executive team and two members of the IOP staff, two adult members of the IOP who provide full-time support for the students. And during that meeting, there's a very clear rift between those staff members and the IOP executive team and Nouriel. Those staff members are telling Nouriel that, hey, we can't run forward with this. This is too one-sided. You need to go back to the drawing board and make those changes. Nouriel's standing his ground. He's saying that I'm the program chair. I am the one that's going to lead CAP this semester, and I have that autonomy to be able to propose what I'm hoping to educate students that join my program about. And so that is the first time that we see that rift. And in fact, in that meeting, he says that he feels unhappy with how CAP is being run and how his leadership, his autonomy is being challenged. And so that's the early indication that we see that Nouriel is his own man right now. There is that conflict. Since then, he has at least five more meetings, I should say, with various factions of the IOP, including two meetings with IOP Director Seti Warren, where, again, he tries to win Seti Warren's support on his proposal. Unfortunately, Warren never extends his support to Nouriel. By the end of it, Nouriel has chatted with members of the IOP executive team, has chatted with members of IOP staff, has chatted with the IOP director, and has never found any support. And at one point, he decides that resigning would be a more powerful statement and continuing forward with what appears to be his unsuccessful effort to revamp CAP to focus more on Israel and Palestine.
And now there are also internal conversations among student leaders at the IOP happening at the same time. Nouriel himself calls out the vice president of the IOP Student Advisory Committee. Tell us who the vice president is and what he said, how that plays into this all.
So the vice president of the IOP is named Ethan Kelly. He's a senior at the college right now, and he's very much involved with politics on campus and just politics nationally. He, in addition to working for the IOP, also helps lead Harvard for Harris, Harvard College's organization that's working to elect Kamala Harris for president. And he also works on, or at least over the summer, worked on Kamala Harris's campaign team running her social media accounts to boost engagement with younger Gen Z voters. So he's very much engaged with politics and with the IOP, generally speaking. Where Ethan comes to a head with Nouriel is over these text messages that Ethan sends in a group chat with the rest of the IOP executive committee. So that includes the president, Prat Malik, and two other senior leaders. In these messages, Ethan writes that he's, quote, 10,000% opposed to any and all Israel and Palestine discussions in what he calls our programming in the text message. In a statement to the Crimson, Ethan described this text message as a cherry-picked quote from a much longer, broader series of conversations between members of the IOP executive team. But Nouriel takes serious issue with it, saying it's evidence that Ethan and more broadly the IOP is opposed to any programming on Palestine, and that their main objection with his revised proposal that he submits on August 29th is the fact that it concerns Palestine, pro-Palestine advocacy. He calls it, in fact, a Palestine exception to free speech. This is where the relationship between the IOP and Nouriel implodes, in a sense, at a much more personal level.
And it's important to note that this is not the first time that the phrase Palestinian exception to free speech has been invoked on campus in response to the university's disciplinary response towards a number of pro-Palestine activists on campus who participated in the Harvard Yard encampment. Organizers in favor of Palestine had also described the sort of crackdown, the attempts to restrict protests and the messages that protesters were sending as also a, quote, sort of Palestinian exception to free speech. So this phrase isn't new, but Nouriel is also sort of pulling that back in here. Tell us then what the IOP tries to do to try to salvage this a little bit, if anything.
Right. And I think before we get into that, one key thing that's important to note is that this is not the first time that the IOP has contended with student leaders resigning over Israel and Palestine. In October, days after Hamas launched its October 7th attack, 3 program chairs, just like Nouriel, resigned because the group opted against releasing a statement condemning Hamas. At that time, those 3 members blasted the IOP, saying that it was against free expression, it was against calling out what they had described as a violent act. And so I think that's important to note here is that the IOP has previously seen this type of conflict that stemmed out of the Israel-Palestine war and what that has meant for its student leaders. And so what does the IOP try to do in this case? Two things. Well, first and foremost, they try to strike a deal with Nuriel. And their proposal is, hey, Nuriel, let's focus CAP more so on your original proposal to be solely focused on the election, the 2024 election, politics, campaigning, grassroots organizing, the typical thing there. But let's have a separate track that's focused on the Israel-Palestine issues that you're trying to bring up through your proposed curriculum. So that's the deal that they're trying to strike with Nuriel. And when I say they, I'm talking about the IOP executive team, the students, the 2 staff members that I had previously hinted at, but also IOP Director Seti Warren, who endorsed this proposal and who put his support behind it. What's Nuriel's response, though? He says no. He rejects that proposal because he wants to focus CAP solely on Israel and Palestine, or to have a more heavy focus on that. He thinks that the 2-track solution would dilute the programming that he was hoping to do. And so that, again, indicates that this conflict is one that the IOP had attempted to resolve internally, privately through that compromise. But once they proposed that in their September 8th meeting and Nuriel said no, a lot of folks, what we're hearing from our sources is that they saw the situation quickly snowballing into one that was going out of their control.
So, of course, this eventually comes to a resignation. Tell us when Nuriel decides to resign, how news gets out, and whether people were surprised by his resignation or not.
So Nuriel submits his letter of resignation on last Monday, September 30th. He sends this in an email to the IOP executive team, to IOP senior staff, just laying out his frustrations with the IOP, with CAP, and explaining why he has decided to resign. His resignation didn't come as much of a surprise, according to what we're hearing. We've heard from some sources that even as early as a meeting in early September, Nuriel had expressed serious frustration with IOP, with the situation, maybe had even hinted at a resignation. So it didn't come as much of a surprise to student leaders in the IOP for sure.
And let me also note that it didn't come as a surprise to other members of CAP leadership, but this was certainly something that took other members of IOP leadership, right? The other 13, 14 programs that the IOP has, those members were surprised by the situation. Nuriel's frustration with CAP was evidently seen by other folks, right? They were questioning, hey, why isn't CAP sending out acceptances yet? Why has CAP programming not begun? But they weren't cued into the specific disagreements and debates that Nuriel was having with the IOP executive staff. And so let's talk specifics here, right? So in his resignation email, Nuriel particularly writes that the IOP is telling him that his proposed August blueprint that was heavily focused on Palestine advocacy, the IOP is telling him that that's too thematically narrow. Nuriel saying that, hey, last spring, the proposal that I had submitted to you all and the proposal that ended up actually going through was very much focused solely on Cambridge and Boston advocacy. And so in his resignation email, which was obtained by the Crimson, he's writing that, hey, my proposal last spring was also pretty thematically narrow. And at that point, you all didn't say anything. So then why are you bringing up this backlash and this criticism only when I've tried to focus now on Israel and Palestine? So that's his thesis right there, right? And so I think it's important to note that as well, that he draws his contrast with what he's done in the spring 2024 semester as a episode to look at in terms of what the IOP's response
almost like an AP test, right?
That's exactly right. Comparing the IOP's response in the past to what it is doing now, Nuriel saying that it's interfering far more now when he's talking about Israel and Palestine than it ever has before, at least in his experience.
Has the IOP offered a response to these criticisms?
Yeah. In fact, Pratt Malik, the president of the IOP, wrote in a statement to the Crimson to us, just saying that the reason the IOP had greenlit Nuriel's programming for last spring and not this one was really that last spring's was, even though its scope was narrow, the topics were still really much focused on elections, on campaigns, even if it were at the local level. And according to our sources, that was very much in line with what CAP had done in the past. Clearly, Nuriel doesn't see it the same way, but that was the IOP's perspective on that. In terms of the IOP's responses to Nuriel's broader criticisms, the IOP had stated that their biggest concerns was the fact that this program change was happening very late in the process. They had already spent several months since July 1st when the IOP Common App dropped, advertising CAP as focused on the 2024 U.S. elections and had, as Drew mentioned earlier, prospective students, especially first years, applying to the program under the assumption that that's the work that they were going to do. So that was really big for the IOP, at least according to the executive team, to Pratt, to Ethan, to their side of the story.
Something that we've implied throughout this conversation, and something that I think would be good just to say for robustness, is that this was very much a Nouriel-led show, right? So CAP has 4 members in its leadership committee, and in the sources that we've been speaking to, we were hearing that this was a one-man show. Nouriel was the one that was leading this effort individually and independently to revise the CAP curriculum.
Is Nouriel or was Nouriel before his resignation the primary leader of CAP, or did he hold a position very similar to the other members of the CAP leadership team?
He was very much so the primary leader. And so while there was a deputy chair, there were other members of sourcing and directors, different titles, he was the chair.
So let's zoom out a little bit. We're a week off from Nouriel's resignation, and we'll be talking to Nouriel later in the show to hear his thoughts and perspectives on this. But what can we take away in the way of learning about how the IOP works and sort of what this says about broader campus discourse around Israel and Palestine?
For sure. I mean, on the point of the IOP, one of the most interesting questions that emerged, at least in our reporting, was the question of how much room program chairs have to revamp their programming, as Nouriel had tried to do. According to our sources, IOP program chairs do get to obviously pitch. On the flip side, though, they're very much beholden to the IOP staff and executive team in terms of receiving funding and getting the ultimate green light. The program chair doesn't have final say, even though they're sort of an elected leader that is supposed to lead this very significant program on campaigning and advocacy.
Right. And I think more broadly, there's 2 ways to look at Nouriel's resignation from the IOP. The first way is that, hey, this is just a story of a chair going rogue. And the second way to look at it is that when we see Harvard right now, we see that it's taking heightened responses to more traditional forms of protesting, right? Having an encampment, making speeches, making rallies, making protests, those type of typical protest activities are being met with heightened responses from the university. And so what we're seeing, I guess, in this situation, too, is these pro-Palestine organizers are using their existing leadership roles and positions on campus and using those as proxies to be able to increase discourse.
Yeah, and on that note, on the flip side, too, I think this situation illustrates how there's some serious reticence among student leaders to engage with these types of conversations, especially on this issue of Israel and Palestine. Right after Ethan sends his text message about being, quote unquote, 10,000% opposed to any and all Israel and Palestine programming, he also sends a message to the recipient, to the IOP executive team group chat, saying that he's concerned about safety. And in a statement to the Crimson later, he also brings up safety as a concern for holding programming on Israel and Palestine. And, the IOP has said in statements that it's still committed to holding these discussions, but there's certainly sort of some concern among student leaders like Ethan that this issue could lead to serious security risks for students, and there's clearly concern on that end as well in terms of engaging with these discussions.
Thank you so much, Drew and William, for joining us to break down this sort of high-profile resignation at the Harvard Institute of Politics and what we can learn from it.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you. This was wonderful.
Joining us now is Nouriel de Graaf, former chair of the Campaigns and Advocacy Program at the Institute of Politics and a member of the Crimson editorial board. Thank you so much for joining me, Nouriel. So last week you sent out a fairly damning resignation letter, stepping down from your position as the chair of the Campaign and Advocacy Program of the Institute of Politics. Now, this is pretty significant. I mean, CAP is one of the more highly attended programs of the IOP, an organization that has more than 1,000 students. So did you expect this resignation to make as big of a splash as it did?
Yeah, that's a great question. I definitely expected, some splash to be made. I think my intended splash was for people to really think about why I had resigned. And I had the goal of not only resigning out of my own kind of moral duty, but also resigning in the hopes that, this would expose some of, what I've kind of called the Palestine Exception to Free Speech, manifesting within the IOP, specifically within the oversight by leadership of my proposed programming for CAP, for the Campaigns and Advocacy Program.
All right, so let's definitely talk about this big criticism that you've leveled at the IOP, which, again, is one of the biggest organizations here at Harvard, namely that their rejection of your CAP proposal constitutes what you said is the Palestinian exception to free speech. So tell me more about why you think your experience has been evidence of that.
Yeah, great question. So I guess first, for some context for people who may not know, what a Palestine exception to free speech is. It's been kind of interpreted and used in many different ways. I think broadly, my understanding is that it's, the idea that free speech should be protected for everyone in all kinds of views. But for some reason, oftentimes, whether it's in academia, on college campuses, in, national discourse, speech that is either generally about Palestine, but specifically speech that is pro-Palestine, tends to be censored or given less credence under the guidelines of free speech. In terms of this particular situation, it would kind of be the former in that, it was not just speech that was pro-Palestine, but speech that was broadly about Palestine that was prevented from kind of going through in the Campaigns and Advocacy Program. The broad claim that I made both in my op-ed and just in my resignation letter is that I wasn't new to this program. I've run this program for one semester already. And in my past semester as chair of the program, I put forth a very similar in some ways proposal in the fact that it was very narrow. I had a whole semester just about politics in Cambridge and a little bit in Boston in the spring of 2024. And in that programming, we didn't really spend a lot of time talking about presidential elections or large-scale campaign skills. And it was really just focused on talking to local politicians and what issues do they care about and how do they, advocate for what they care about in their communities.
So you've brought up this syllabus from spring 2024, one that you think is similarly narrow to your newer fall 2024 proposal, focusing on Israel and Palestine. But the IOP has said that the scope of your spring proposal was narrow, but accepted because of its primary focus on local elections and campaigns in the Boston-Cambridge area. How would you respond to the criticism that the narrowness of your newer proposal is not really the same as your previous syllabus?
Yeah, right, the narrowness. So I think I agree that there were different types of syllabi, but the original criticism I received when I made this kind of comparison when I was meeting with IOP student leadership was that despite the spring syllabus being very specific in terms of being about Cambridge and Boston, it was still broad in the sense that, municipal politics, local politics is something that's relevant to all areas. There's local politics in every state, in every country, right? And I totally agreed with this. And in response to that, I also made the point that, despite the proposed thematic focus on advocacy, around Israel and Palestine, those tools used to kind of make change and advocate for whatever position people believe in are also similarly very applicable. For example, the idea of a boycott, right, is something that has not just come up in the context of Israel and Palestine advocacy, but it's come up in countless other kind of, social change, social justice movements in the world. And so my kind of general response was that in the very similar way that, the locality of Cambridge and Boston politics is applicable to everywhere in the country and in the world, the tools and methods used for making change in the realm, the sphere of Israel and Palestine advocacy are also similarly applicable. And it made this very clear from the beginning that it wouldn't be a debate on, Israel and Palestine substantively, what's the better side to be on, stuff like that. It was really using the lens of Israel and Palestine as a case study to understand, how do people make change in these kind of spheres and what works and what doesn't work and why do people do the things they do.
I really want to talk about that last point you made there about not really wanting to have any substantive debate about Israel and Palestine, because I think another criticism of your newer syllabus was that it was too biased. In the first iteration of that syllabus, you omitted any pro-Israel advocacy within the programming. So I was wondering, how did you respond to that criticism, and how do you balance the sort of nonpartisan educational commitment of the IOP with what seems to be like an incredibly polarized issue, which, has been the subject of immense dispute on campus and on a national stage?
Yeah, great question. Definitely one piece of criticism I got on my initial proposal was that it was, like you said, maybe too biased, emphasized too much, pro-Palestine advocacy and not enough, or not at all pro-Israel advocacy. And the reason for this kind of criticism from leadership at this point, it was also staff leadership, was that, the IOP is supposed to be a neutral space and not giving kind of priorities to any kind of views. But again, if you look at my spring syllabus, I had 7 or 8 speakers, I believe, and every single one of those speakers was a Democrat. I had no Republican speakers, for better or for worse. And so the ideological slant of my spring syllabus, when it came to Cambridge and Boston politics, was very, very biased as well. It was extremely biased towards the left, I would say. Not only were all of my speakers Democrats, I would say the majority of them would probably self-identify as progressives, right? And so in terms of the left-right political spectrum, I had an extremely unbalanced syllabus. But again, I heard no complaints from students in the program, no complaints from student leadership at the IOP, and certainly no complaints from any staff leadership at the IOP. And so that definitely is important context, I feel, going back to the idea of the Palestine exception. It's okay to have a very biased and unbalanced syllabus when it's talking about certain issues, but then if that biased and unbalanced syllabus is talking about, Israel and Palestine, then it becomes an issue. That being said, I totally agree that my initial blueprint or initial kind of written syllabus was definitely biased. It had, more weeks that covered pro-Palestine advocacy than covered pro-Israel advocacy. One potential reason for this is that, when it comes to the United States, and especially on college campuses, we've just been seeing so much more pro-Palestine advocacy than pro-Israel advocacy. And so where it comes from, choosing speakers and understanding, what are the kind of plethora of kind of methods for change that are being used, sampling from the world of pro-Palestine advocacy is a bit more fruitful. But that being said, I totally agree that it's important to have kind of ideological diversity, especially on such a controversial issue. And so a few weeks later, after a series of kind of back and forth with IOP student and staff leadership, I submitted another proposal that I felt was an even stronger compromise with their views, and made sure to make it much more unbiased. In this proposal, I had 7 weeks that were about kind of either directly the presidential 2024 election or general kind of campaign skills and concepts. And then I had 2 weeks that were dedicated to Israel and Palestine advocacy. And one of those was about pro-Palestine advocacy, and one of those was pro-Israel advocacy. And so this second written blueprint that I submitted in September was one that I believed was, almost as unbiased as it could be. And I viewed it as a massive compromise based on the feedback I'd received. But unfortunately, this proposal was still rejected, despite having addressed that issue of being biased.
I think leaders of the IOP also mentioned some concerns about the timeline in which you floated this new proposal. I mean, in June, you had proposed an original program that focused on the 2024 election. And on July 1st, that was approved by leadership. And then applications opened on August 19th. And between then and September, over 100 people applied to the CAP program under the impression that they were applying to a program centered on the 2024 election. But then in August, you began to float this idea of having a program centered more on pro-Palestine advocacy. And so I'm curious about the change of heart that you had, especially considering, you've been involved in pro-Palestine advocacy on campus for a while now. So I'm wondering what exactly led to the change in proposal between June and August?
Totally correct in that, by the time I had even floated this proposal, the applications had been open. And I made sure to note to the IOP student leadership that I understand it's kind of a tight timeline. And so I wanted to make sure, if there was a chance of this happening, that we could really discuss it with a little bit of haste. Because I didn't want to get to a point where people would apply under the pretense of the kind of potentially outdated syllabus and outdated kind of program focus. But also an overall frustration throughout the whole month between late August and late September was that I felt that there was kind of a lack of response time and kind of slow going process made it really hard to make sure we could advertise to the students before they applied. In terms of the change of heart, I'd been thinking about, Israel and Palestine for a long time. And so it wasn't just anything that happened in those 2 months over the summer that changed my heart, but I think it's something that I had been thinking about, and especially with the Democratic National Convention and actually working for a candidate myself, I was able to kind of understand where the Democratic Party was going with this and the lack of kind of care and emphasis they were placing on Palestinian lives. And it just became, an issue of concern. And I thought that because of that, it would be a perfect thing to talk about, a very, very current matter, definitely a controversial one. And because of that, a perfect way to understand, really how complex advocacy is and how complex, making change is. And I thought there was no better lens or case study for students in the fall semester to understand really why do we make change? How do we make that change? And what are the different considerations, right? And of course, I understood that the 2024 election was still important. And so that's why I made sure to emphasize that in my first written proposal. And I had 5 weeks that were just dedicated to either the 2024 election specifically or in general kind of presidential campaign strategies and core skills.
All right, so after you submitted this first proposal, again, we touched a little bit on the criticism you received for being too biased, having no mention of any pro-Israel advocacy in that first syllabus. But then, sort of initially, as a response to your newer proposal, IOP leaders gave you a counterproposal of their own, which essentially was structured as a two-track approach to prospective campaign and advocacy program, in which, one track would deal more with the 2024 election and the other track would involve deeper discussion of the Israel-Palestine conflict. So why did you reject that proposal?
Yeah, I think that's a really important question. And I think now is a kind of really perfect time to talk about, what had been going through the back of my head during this whole process. And the hunch that I had kind of very early on that became confirmed as the weeks went on was that really the IOP student and staff leadership had no excitement and, if anything, in the opposite direction, really did not want to talk about Israel and Palestine in any kind of programming. So I guess the two things I'll say to contextualize that was that first, someone on the IOP executive team had sent me this text that I had seen from the IOP vice president, which really horrified me, in which he said that he was 10,000% opposed to any talk, of Israel and Palestine in our programming. And whether you take our to mean the IOP, which is how I interpreted it at first, or our to mean the campaigns and advocacy programming, either way, it's very clear that at least from one member of the executive team, and I would say, it's a 4-person executive team, 2 of the members were really not involved in this process. And so it was really the IOP president and vice president. And for the vice president to so clearly and so comfortably say that he wants no talk whatsoever of Israel and Palestine, at the very least in the campaigns and advocacy program, and then to simultaneously hear from the president, on the other hand, that, look, there's this 2-tracks proposal, and we really do want to talk about this, but maybe why don't we do it in this 2-tracks way? That might be more helpful. It just seemed completely disingenuous, and I had no faith that even if I had accepted that, I would have sufficient funding or sufficient care or sufficient kind of staff resources, and I just had no confidence that this would be a priority of IOP student leadership or staff leadership for that matter. The second piece of important context that really led me to believe that the IOP student and staff leadership view discussions on Israel and Palestine as a very small priority was that when I looked through the JFK Junior Forum's offerings and had been, directed to the JFK Junior Forum as a potential avenue for more discussions about Israel and Palestine by the IOP president when we first met in late August, I was told, maybe CAP is not the best place to do this. He thought the forum was a really great place to do these kinds of conversations and was more equipped to have a facilitator and have these tough conversations. And so I recently looked at the forum's offerings, and it turns out that since October 7th, 2023, the JFK Junior Forum has hosted 2 forums either on or even vaguely about Israel and Palestine since October 7th. And then there was one scheduled for Monday, October 7th, 2024, but that is also now canceled. You could argue the forum is the IOP's kind of flagship program. To see only 2 completed discussions on or even centrally mentioning the topic of Israel-Palestine seemed to me a huge shock and a huge failure of the IOP to really highlight an issue that has, obviously had an immense amount of global importance, but also specifically too, the IOP's goals have had an immense amount of influence on the 2024 presidential election, and it's, an issue that has touched every kind of aspect of the American political scene since October 7th. And so with all that in mind, I felt that if I agreed to this, it would just lead to the further kind of sidelining of these goals. Initially, this 2-track proposal was, the main or central CAP track would be their proposed campaign-focused track. And then this Israel-Palestine would not even be originally part of CAP. It would be a separate track that I would also run that people could opt into. Later on, their proposals to make both of those technically part of CAP, but to me it was clear that this Israel-Palestine track would never be a priority and would also, not receive the attention it needed from staff. And again, based on the vice president's sentiments, I had no confidence that it wouldn't just be shut down, in a few weeks later as soon as we got the main CAP going as well.
Bringing up all this about, proper mediation, having these conversations with a proper facilitator, and, these are conversations that have really provoked immense tension on campuses and nationally. Why do you think CAP was primed to take on these discussions?
That's a great question. And I think the way I viewed it, I didn't see CAP as the only potential avenue for this. I just knew that, based on what I had seen, it was not really happening substantively anywhere in the IOP from any angle. So I thought, CAP shouldn't be the only place we're talking about this, but it certainly can be one. Also, it's called the Campaigns and Advocacy Program. And for me, talk of campaigns and advocacy is totally empty if we just fully abstract it from any political, contemporary reality. And so for me, the Israel and Palestine idea was a lens to both understand, look, campaigns and advocacy isn't an abstract concept. There are people who are actually doing that day in and day out in their lives, and they're really dedicating themselves to making change in these X, Y, and Z ways. Then we could talk about these ways and understand, which ways are better, depending on what your goals are. But again, the idea was never to make this a place for debate or a place to really discuss the merits of both sides. It was really a way to discuss, how are people making change in these realms. In terms of the facilitator point, I think it's a great point. I had 2 meetings with the IOP director. And in my first meeting with the director, he asked me if I was willing to compromise. And I think this goes back to the main idea that, I felt like the IOP student and staff leadership was really trying to paint me as someone who was, quite stubborn and not willing to compromise. But again, first of all, I had those 2 different proposals, the first one of which was already a massive compromise from my initial kind of vision from August. And then, the later one in September was an even further compromise based on their continued feedback. Another suggestion that I got from the director was that we should have a facilitator who might be more experienced at having these tough conversations. And that was something that I immediately agreed to. And I felt like, I'm sure a facilitator who's had experience would probably be much better at facilitating these discussions than someone like me. And even though these conversations shouldn't really be going into the nitty-gritty of, Israel versus Palestine, who's doing the right thing, it's a tense topic. And so I was totally on board with the facilitator. But again, agreeing to that and having, further compromises like that were still not enough to get the proposal through.
So it seems like, additionally, you're bringing up a lot of what seems like stressful back and forth with members of the IOP leadership team. I'm wondering if you can just walk me through how you were feeling at that time, how your relationship with the institution has changed.
Yeah, I would say the most stressful thing was just like feeling like, this process was one that wouldn't have happened if it was any other context. Never throughout this process did I level this accusation of it being a Palestine exception to free speech until really later on when it became much more clear to me. But before I even mentioned this to the IOP director, he actually brought it up and he said this would have happened the same way if it was about, Ukraine and Russia, for example, and just kind of trying to really prove the point that it was not about the fact that it was about Israel and Palestine, but about the way that it had happened or the fact that it was too narrow or whatnot. Hearing things like that and then just kind of having the context of the past spring semester and just really seeing those juxtaposed together and really feeling strongly that this was not a content neutral process was probably the most stressful thing about it all, because we've seen administration doing this for the past many months, doling out harsher consequences to student protesters than in protests of years past and really just being very harsh and opaque in their own kind of disciplinary procedures. I myself was someone who got, put on academic probation following a process that was very rushed, very opaque for sure. And so coming from that context and then seeing a student organization, one that I thought was kind of meant to talk about, tough conversations and meant to talk about politics, which is really not always an easy thing to talk about, reacting to my proposal in such a similar kind of draconian and harsh and really suppressive way was kind of the most stressful part of it all.
And talk to me more about that characterization, maybe. Draconian, suppressive. Those are strong terms. Why exactly do they describe the IOP's treatment of you?
The reason I use those words is because it was kind of the facade of kindness, especially from the staff. I kept hearing, we really want to work with you on this and we really want to do this and that. But then it was the fact that no matter what I tried and no matter how hard I tried to compromise and no matter how creative I got with my proposals, they had a very, very hard line in terms of what they were willing to talk about, and that had this really, really high bar of, how neutral they had to be and how sensitive they had to be, in the sense that I even heard from one of the staff members, and she wouldn't even mention it by name. She wouldn't say Israel and Palestine, but she would say this topic is not a cold topic, which I took to mean that she was worried that it was too controversial. And that sentiment that we can't be talking about topics that are, current, that are present, that are controversial, that are hot topics, for me, that was extremely problematic because, campaigns and advocacy, again, is not something that's cold. It's not something that's abstract. When people campaign for things or advocate for things, they're doing so because they want to change, real things in the real world that are unjust. And so there's never going to be an example of a true campaigner or a true advocate that's fighting for something that's a cold topic. That would be kind of antithetical to the whole idea of advocacy or campaigning. And so I felt that was very problematic as well.
All right. So after your 2 proposals, October comes around and you resign. So take me through the moment where you ultimately decided, okay, I've spent a lot of time invested in this organization. I'm leadership for this organization, but now is the time I'm going to resign. What was that moment like?
Yeah. So it was a Thursday before the Monday where I resigned, where I initially floated the idea to my leadership team because I felt that we were all very frustrated. We had reached an impasse where it was clear that, IOP student and staff leadership was really not willing to budge any further or at all. And at the same time, I felt that I couldn't, at this point, just kind of totally give up on this proposal and, teach the exact proposal that they wanted me to go through with. And so I floated the idea of my resignation. And, I was happy that, the members of my leadership team didn't want that. That wasn't their first choice. But I still felt like it might just have to be the response, to have the program moving forward, because any continued stalling would just kind of have an adverse effect on the people who we were going to let into the program. And that was not right for them either. And so I just, took the weekend to think about it. And as I wrote in my email, after the whole month of communication that I felt was very opaque, that was not transparent and dishonest, frankly, the efforts for censorship, continually, rejecting my proposals no matter how much I compromised. And then also kind of a deep disrespect for my role as the chair of CAP. There were many times where the IOP student and staff leadership actually, met or attempted to meet with my, leadership team kind of without my knowledge, behind my back, sometimes in benign ways just to check in on them, make sure they're doing okay. But in other meetings, their goal was to actually develop a, alternative programming without my knowledge, so that way, just in case if I resigned, they would have something to go through.
Right. So given the disconnect there, you resigned. Have you found much support among, fellow students from specifically pro-Palestinian spaces on campus, especially after you cited the Palestine exception to free speech?
Yeah, I've been lucky. A lot of people were, really supportive, would, reach out to me and either directly about the op-ed or about the process itself. I got a lot of support for my piece and for my stance. I think a lot of people respected, the kind of moral clarity that I tried to act upon, in my resignation. I think people were definitely frustrated with the situation as well and sympathized with my frustrations. But I think overall I received a lot of support, definitely, from people among the pro-Palestine space, but also just, friends and other people who read the piece and thought it was good. I definitely haven't gotten much hate or any negative feedback. I did get one scary email that was from a random account that was kind of referencing the pager attacks from Israel and Lebanon and, calling me Hassan Nasrallah, who is the leader of Hezbollah. So that was kind of a scary reference to get, and that was kind of the only bad part of the whole thing. But other than that, the kind of, response has been pretty positive.
So you found support on campus. But what do you think the major takeaway of this whole experience is? What do you think it says more broadly about campus culture, about discourse on campus?
For me, this experience that I've had, being censored, being suppressed, my proposals being rejected by the IOP student and staff leadership, is really a symptom of a larger problem that I've, as I mentioned, I've seen with the Harvard administration and how they severely target, pro-Palestine student protesters. And for me, this is an even more, in some ways, egregious example because, while I am a pro-Palestine protester in other capacities, right, my job here as chair of CAP was not in that same vein at all. And I had no goals of advancing a purely pro-Palestine agenda. I was more than happy to, update my proposal to make sure it was unbiased and it was reflective of both, pro-Israel and pro-Palestine views. And for still that proposal to be rejected and for still any balanced discussion on Israel-Palestine within my program to be rejected is really a sign of where we are, in terms of free speech on campus and in terms of, what kind of speech institutions are able to allow. And it's one thing for an institution like the university to not allow certain speech, and that's horrible on its own. But for student organizations, especially, like you mentioned, very, very large student organizations who purport to talk about politics and be political organizations, for groups like that to also censor speech around Israel and Palestine, perhaps because they might, not be only pro-Israel or not solely in support of Israel, for any of that balanced speech to be censored is a very big problem for free speech. And I think anybody who, is worried about discourse and is worried about having, intellectual diversity and an exchange of ideas in different institutions should be really concerned by this process.
I think we'll end there. Thank you so much for joining me to discuss your op-ed, to discuss your resignation. It was really lovely to have you on here.
Thank you so much.
Newstalk is co-hosted by Yael S. Goldstein and Frank S. Joe. This episode was produced by Yael S. Goldstein, Elise A. Spenner, and Frank S. Joe. Our multimedia chairs are Julian J. Giordano and Addison Y. Liu. Our associate managing editors are Elias J. Siskel and Claire Yuan, and our managing editor is Miles J. Herzenhorn. Our president is J. Sellers Hill. From 14 Plimpton Street, this is Newstalk.
Thank you so much for listening. Newstalk is going on a brief break. We'll be off for a few weeks and back very soon. Thank you so much for listening.